Now let's look at how economists think and what the economic way of thinking is and how we might attack answering the questions that are posed to economists. Well, economists in general use assumptions to simplify the world. We're going to build economic models that have supply and demand graphs that are going to interact with each other. We're going to have a demand and a supply. And then we're going to try to look at how the decisions of producers interact with decisions of consumers and how those interactions determine the quantity and the price of a good or a service. Now, when we build this model, which we're going to learn a lot about in this course, when we build this model, we have to make assumptions to simplify how the world works. Right? One of those assumptions is we're going to isolate the variables that we look at. Right? In this model, we're looking at a variable of price and quantity and how changes in the price might affect the quantity. We call this a ceteris paribus assumption, right? That any variable that affects the supply and demand of a good or a service is held constant. So we isolate two of the variables that we're looking at, assuming everything else is held fixed. Now, this is an oversimplification of how the world works, because in reality, all kinds of things happen at the same time. But it makes it very hard to answer questions if we're trying to look at how everything in the world changes all at the same time. So we're going to isolate the variables that we're interested in looking at, assuming that we're holding other variables constant. Now, that doesn't mean we don't think those other variables change, but we need to simplify the world so that we can make reasonable choices and decisions about how one variable affects another variable. In the end, we might add up changes of all the variables and try to figure out how multiple different changes affect one aspect of our economy. But we have to do that first by simplifying our assumption and getting down to just a ceteris paribus, or looking at two variables at one time. Economists also look at small changes in one variable and how that small change affects another variable. We call this a marginal change. In other words, a small or 1 unit change in a value. For example, how much more will you earn if you work for another hour? And that's a marginal change in your labor input, and we try to figure out how does that affect your income. By looking at small changes, we're able to refine our analysis and become much better at looking at how people make choices. Finally, we assume that rational people respond to incentives. And this is another way to think about economics. This is the study of how rational people respond to incentives. And we think it'd be foolish to think that rational people wouldn't respond to incentives. This is one of the key assumptions of most economic analysis, right? That people act in their own self-interest. Now let's look at how this economic way of thinking might answer that we would be posed. Again, let's look at the congestion problem. We're assuming, as an economist, how are we going to approach the problem of traffic congestion? Each driver slows down other drivers, but each driver ignores the costs that they're imposing on these other drivers. When I get on the freeway, I am slowing everybody else down. But I ignore how my entering the freeway slows everybody else down because it's not a cost that I have to incur. So an economic way of looking at it is to impose a congestion tax that gets me to not ignore these time costs. So the question we want to answer is, how high should the tax be? Well, first we have to use assumptions to simplify. And if we looked at how every single car affected other people's travel time, and that was different for every car, that would be too complicated. So we're going to assume that every car has the same effect on travel time of other cars. And so this is an assumption we're making to simplify our analysis. Now, we're also going to isolate the variables we're looking at. We make the ceteris paribus assumption that everything else that affects travel behavior, which there are lots of things that are going to affect travel behavior, like the price of gasoline, bus fares, consumer income. All of these things are going to affect traffic congestion and travel behavior. But if I were to look at both the effect of one car entering the freeway and price of gasoline, bus fare, and consumer income, the analysis would get too cumbersome and too hard to tease out the effect of the one driver. So we're going to assume that all these things remain fixed. Right? So we make an assumption to simplify the world. One of those assumptions is that every car that enters the freeway affects other people's travel time the same. We also assume that other variables that affect travel behavior are held fixed. And then we're going to think at the margin. What's the effect of one car going on the highway? Okay, so if the marginal driver, or if one car enters the highway, and there are 900 other commuters on the highway, how does that one car affect those 900 commuters? Let's assume that it causes those 900 drivers to add another 2 seconds to their highway time. Now this doesn't seem like very much, 2 seconds added to highway time. But if we add that up across 900 cars, that's an additional 30 minutes that everybody on the highway has to add to their day. Not total 30 minutes to each driver, but adding 2 seconds to each driver adds 30 minutes of total travel time for the commuters on the highway. So if the value of time, suppose that the value of time is $16 per hour, then the appropriate congestion tax would be $8. And if I drive on the freeway, I slow down everybody else on the freeway by a total of 30 minutes, and if time is worth $16 per hour, I've cost the drivers on the freeway $8. So if the appropriate congestion tax is that tax which would get me to consider my effect on other drivers, that appropriate congestion tax would be $8. And then I would have the incentive to reduce the number of times that I was on the freeway and reduce it the appropriate amount based on how much time I'm costing other drivers.